Professor Terence Gomez for giving his views on Malaysian political economy in general and Malaysian Indian community in general, I mean, in particular. So thank you for having you here. It's my pleasure to have you here in this conversation. So it'll be a freewheeling chat discussion with you. The first question to you: could you discuss in detail about Malaysia's economic development models? I wonder what are the models that you been pursuing since independence?
The first model, let me put it this way. Let's look at key critical moments in Malaysian history. The first key moment in history was the independence period when we achieved independence from the British. There we obtained a more laissez-faire type economy. The second defining moment was in 1969 when we had the race riots. Because no fundamental change, structural change had occurred in the economy up between 1957 and 1969. After the riots, one of the most important structural changes that occurred was the introduction of the new economic policy, which was an affirmative action-based policy which led to the intervention of the state in the economy. This was a fundamental shift. The state now became a big player in the economy. And the state did that primarily by channeling a lot of funds to what they call public enterprises, later called government-linked investment companies, which went and bought out equity owned by the foreigners. And by the late 1970s, the state had, within a span of just a decade, emerged as a key shareholder of equity and a key actor in the economy. The third defining moment was 1981, when Malaysia got a new prime minister. His name was Mahathir Mohamad. He said, well, yes, I was an architect of state intervention in the economy. I would also like to introduce more neoliberal type policies like privatization. And rather than create government-linked companies, I want to create private capitalists, Malay capitalists. And he actively advocated this through privatization. Those are three core periods where you can see major transitions happening. But what is interesting about 1981 was you see now a mix between the developmental state structure of 1970 mixed very closely with a neoliberal structure of 1981. This is very unique and very interesting, the mix between the developmental state and the neoliberal state. But the important point to remember is that even though the state introduced a neoliberal type structure, the state was still the key actor. The state could still dictate who got the privatized rents. The state could even dictate how these privatized rents were developed. Another important or defining moment in Malaysia was 1997 when the Asian financial crisis occurred. That's when everything dismantled. And since then, what we have seen is now the falling away of neoliberal type ideas and the re-emergence of the state as the key player in the economy. The state still talks about neoliberal policies. The state still talks about the need to let private business be the primary engine of growth and about the importance of privatization and about the need for small government. But the fact of the matter is, till today, the government is the key player in the economy and it determines the nature of development of the economy as well as the corporate sector.
I read your book on Malaysian political economy, patronage, politics. Yeah, can you just brief about how the situation is now? Is it remained same or it has really moved on? I mean,
yes, that's an important question because that book was published in 1997 and we introduced a new edition in 1999 after the Asian financial crisis, which, as I just said, was an epochal moment. It was an epochal moment in the sense that the GLCs, the government-linked companies, re-emerged as key actors in the economy. They were now the most powerful institutions in the corporate sector. But something else happened in the economy. A feud occurred between the Prime Minister, Mahathir, and his deputy, Anwar. And then we saw a realignment of politics and the concentration of power in the office of the Prime Minister. Now, what is important here now is a shift. We're seeing a fundamental shift from power from the hegemonic party in the government, in the coalition, the United Malays National Organization, Mahathir's party, UMNO. The power had shifted from UMNO to the Prime Minister. Today, what we have not noticed is that the Prime Minister, who now also functions as the Finance Minister, not only has economic power, but he also has economic power through the GLCs. This is unprecedented, the concentration of economic and political power in the office of the executive. And the executive now has become the most powerful actor in the Malaysian political economy. We have not seen this before. And he's now using it in a way in which he can further consolidate his own position and even discipline his own party members, as well as the party as a whole. Because the primary point here is this: the country introduced affirmative action in 1970. It was part of the new economic policy which led to state intervention. Patronage through affirmative action got hijacked by the party. It was supposed to be for the poor, but most of the rents were going to party members themselves. And so that led to a politics of patronage within the party. It led to the monetization of politics within the party. When party members wanted rents, they would go and seek out the most powerful party leaders, the warlords, if you like. Today, if you want rents from the state, there's only one person you can go to. That is the Prime Minister, because he's the Finance Minister as well as the Prime Minister. He's the one who controls the rents of the state. The warlords have basically been removed. One of what has happened now, which is very significant, is that in the 1990s, we saw UMNO leaders as key players in the economy, key players in the corporate sector. That is not the case anymore. Today, we don't see UMNO members as key actors in the corporate sector. The key actors in the corporate sector are the government-linked companies. How does the Prime Minister control the government-linked companies? He has created a new managerial class. These are the directors of the GLCs. They have no political influence. They are professionals. They can run the GLCs professionally. The GLCs make money. They declare dividends. They are among the top listed companies. But if the Prime Minister wants to use them and abuse them to serve his own political interest, he can. So the party itself has been sidelined, and the Prime Minister has emerged as the key actor in Malaysia's political economy. It's a significant shift, unprecedented shift. That's why today's Prime Minister, Najib Razak, is seen to be an extremely powerful politician.
I'd like to know the 1MDB scandal. How far the, I mean, how far, I mean, I'd like to know really this Prime Minister was involved in, or he was implicated in that.
The 1MDB is interesting because it draws attention to the shifting nature of the state. As I said earlier, Mahathir was a person who was seen to be a patronage-based Prime Minister, patronage for the sake of creating a new Malay capitalist class. It didn't work. It fell apart after 1997. Under Najib Razak, we don't use the word patronage so much anymore. In fact, 1MDB, basically the allegation behind the scandal is that the Prime Minister created this very powerful sovereign wealth fund, channeled a lot of state-owned money to it. Much of this money was used to buy out assets, especially from abroad. That money was then rechanneled back into the Prime Minister's personal account. Today, the word they use for the Prime Minister is that he's a kleptocrat. So we are seeing now a shift. 1MDB, what it signifies is a shift from a patronage-based state to a kleptocratic type state. That is the seriousness of the 1MDB scandal. And that reflects a lot of what happens when you concentrate a lot of power in the office of the Prime Minister, who also functions as the Finance Minister.
I'd like to know, Chinese have been the dominant economic class in terms of controlling the economic equity. But what are the implications on the Chinese community of this patronage politics? And also you talked about the shift, you know.
I'd like to make a distinction between ownership and control. This is an important distinction. What we have is a very powerful state. The Chinese may have in terms of ethnic groups, may have the largest volume of ownership of equity, about last count 34-35%. Malays, according to government figures, it's about 20%, and Indians about 1.6%. So while the Chinese may appear to have the largest volume of ownership, the fact of the matter is the state has the ability to go in and expropriate that wealth at will, and they have done this in the past. I can cite the example of the bank consolidation exercise of 1999. There were about 57 banks in the country at the time, and Mahathir decided it was too many for a population of 22 million, and he said, merge. And following the merger, From 57 banks, we came down to just a mere 10. A lot of Chinese companies, Chinese family businesses lost their banks, which they had had control over, ownership and control over for about 2 generations. Now that shook up the business community, to my mind. The implications of this, and it's still happening today, is that there's a fear of loss of their property rights. And the loss of the property rights, because of that fear, it has had twofold implication. One is people don't want to invest, especially in R&D. If they invest in R&D and they create big companies, the company can be taken over through affirmative action-based policies. The second is also in the implications of the ability of the state to expropriate wealth at will means that there is a crisis of confidence in terms of investor confidence. And this is the problem now with the Malaysian economy. Domestic investors fear investing in a country, especially if the country is said to have a kleptocratic type leader. So the situation is not good for domestic investors. Chinese businessmen, to my mind, are extremely dynamic, but their dynamism is not being brought into the mainstream of the economy, which is going to be have serious implications for the Malaysian economy.
What about the Indian capitalist class? Because they are really, they need the state patronage or help in order to compete with the Malay capitalists or economic capitalists. What is the status of the Indian capitalist class under circumstances which you have been, which you have described now?
When we talk about Indian capital, if you compare from 1970 to the present period, it hasn't increased much from 1% to about 1.6%. That's not a major shift at all. If you look at the current people who can be classified as the capitalist class among the Indians, the first thing that strikes you about it is they're very diverse. Ananda Krishnan has a stake in telecommunications and Astro TV, satellite TV. Tony Fernandez has got a stake in Air Asia. Mahalingam has got a stake in Westport, the ports. So they're very diverse. And I think when we look at the 1.6% equity attributed to Indians, much of it will go to these 3-4 men. There are a few other capitalists, but not as big as these people. If you look at those Indians at the lower level, especially the poor Indians, they have been so marginalized that the government has created a new institution called SEED. SEED is an institution directly under the Prime Minister's office to try and cultivate Indian enterprises. The problem with that is it is seen as the idea of creating enterprises among Indians who are unemployed or unemployable. They're unemployable because they have no skills. The quality of education that they got does not give them the skills to get jobs. So channel a lot of money to them, ask them to go into business, micro enterprises, and hope for the best. It's a wastage of money because these people just don't have the skills to go into business. Businesses mean having entrepreneurial capacity, the idea of creating a niche economy, taking risks. You don't see all of that. So here we have microfinance type industries being encouraged, channeling a lot of money to non-governmental organizations, asking them to get the money down to unemployed people and ask them to go into business, try and provide them with some skills so that they can run a business. But to my mind, I don't think that is the way forward. And I think it's a significant waste of money. So we won't see too many Indians coming up at that micro informal sector. Then we have the SMEs. There are Indians among the SMEs. They are not very big, but the volume of support for Indians at the SME level, I don't think is sufficient. Those are the people I would focus a lot of attention on. They've already set up companies. These companies are enterprising enough. What do they need money for? For reinvestment, to help them nurture these enterprises, to invest in R&D, because R&D is very expensive. But we don't see much of that happening. The state's idea is they already got businesses, they're making some money out of it. Now we go and tackle the other people. I'm afraid this is not the way you nurture domestic enterprises, even among Indians. So that's also not very effective.
So could you explain the profile of Indian business community during the colonial and contemporary period? Because the Indian community, they have come from labor background. So, but in colonial period, you had the chettiars who were really money lenders and they were really dominating the business scene. So, I'd like to know the present status.
The problem with the Indians, actually the Indians had a presence in the economy. They were landlords. The chettiars were money lenders. But most of the Indians, of course, were indentured labor. And then we also had another group of Indians who were the professionals, the lawyers, the teachers. So there was a diversity among the Indians. What happened was in the immediate post-colonial period, many of the Indians who owned land sold off their land. And that's why we don't see the development of that class of Indians who were landlords. And among the Chettiars, it was not an industry that thrived. The Chetty industry just basically died away after that generation. That generation of Chettiars trained their children, made them professionals, and they went on to become professionals. The Chettiar industry is not an industry that's a major industry today. With the rise of new middle class, with
They are no longer financiers.
They are financiers. You can find them, but I would argue that they are a dying community. They were far more ubiquitous in the economy. You would find them as a major source of money lending to not just Indians, but to a large segment of people. But new institutions have emerged. Now we had banks, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of the banking industry. So it's a different way of doing business. And when you see a structural shift in society and the rise of a new professional middle class, they don't go deal with the Chetties. So the Chetties deal with a different clientele, and that clientele is slowly dying off. So you won't see Indians emerging. Now, you raised an important point. Were there Indian businesses in the past, in the colonial period? Yes. When we looked at the ownership and control patterns of businesses in the immediate post-colonial period, and we looked at them in the 1990s and the present period, the first thing that struck us was the dying away of all these major companies of the colonial period and immediate post-colonial period. Now, this is the problem if you don't have good state policies, including policies that can expropriate wealth at will. And if companies don't reinvest, the companies can die away. What we haven't done enough research on is where have all these big companies gone? Why did they all die off? How did they die off? What are the factors that led to the dying of these major companies?
So I have this pertinent question to you. Why Malaysia? See, Malaysia has opened its economy very long time back, but still you are stuck in Malaysia is stuck in this middle income trap. Why you're not? I mean, why Malaysia is not able to come out of it? What are the underlying reasons behind it?
This thing about Malaysia's development, the issue which I didn't touch on enough. Malaysia had a developmental state structure which entailed massive state intervention in the economy, primarily to nurture domestic firms who would then be the major engines of growth. This is what Japan did, and Korea did, and Taiwan did, and they did it very well. Malaysia did that too, but Malaysia had another dimension to its process of nurturing domestic firms. It was based on race. So while we had dynamic enterprises, which are not Malay owned, they were bypassed to try and create a new class of businessmen. That policy failed. So what that meant was, because of lack of support for dynamic domestic firms, because they feared these domestic firms because they were Chinese-based companies, and because of support, affirmative action-based business patronage, which basically is a flawed policy that also failed. What the government did was they depended very heavily on FDI, foreign direct investments. So here's where Malaysia is very different from Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Malaysia became extremely dependent on FDI, on multinational companies to drive the industrialization process. So for example, if you look at the manufacturing sector, it's basically Chinese and foreign firms. The big firms are the foreign firms and the small firms are the Chinese-owned firms. And they create a networking supply chain between them, which helped drive that industrialization process. That's why the Chinese also survived quite well in spite of affirmative action. But did they grow? No. They didn't grow because they didn't invest in R&D. And because they didn't invest in R&D, they did not acquire the technological know-how to move up the technological ladder and become major enterprises in their own right. So what does that mean today? We still are highly dependent on FDI. And we now have to go and look for FDI and, from America, Europe. That's why policies like regional networks like TPP become extremely important in Malaysia. That is why today the government is looking to China and looking for investments from China now to come and drive Malaysia's economic growth. This is not good in the long run.
You talked about the patronage politics of the BN government, which has been power since independence. I'd like to know from the opposition side, do they have any alternative models to move up your economic growth or economy of Malaysian economy?
That's a very important question, Mahalingam, because in politics, one of the defining moments of Malaysian politics was the 2008 general election. For the first time after the general election, 5 state governments in Malaysia's federal system fell to the opposition. So the opposition now has had control of state governments and for over 8 years. And some of the state governments are extremely industrialized states like Selangor and Penang. They're also extremely poor states like Kelantan. When we looked at the public policies of the opposition over the past 8 years in these 2 highly industrialized states, to our horror, we found there was no difference in public policies between the ruling government and the opposition party, even at the state level. The only state where I saw some differences was probably in the state of Kelantan, led by the Islamic Party PAS, and they had an orientation which is more Islamic based, which has not proven to be extremely helpful because Kelantan still remains an extremely poor state. It has been under opposition rule since 1990, and we haven't seen any major development. Yes, nothing. And I don't see that kind of Islamic-based model of development, whatever it may be, as how they conceive it, having brought about major structural changes in Kelantan. The point about how similar the policies are between the Barisan Nasional, the ruling Barisan Nasional, and the opposition was in the last general election in 2013. When we looked at the manifesto of the 2 coalitions, there was almost no difference in public policies, especially economic policies. In fact, the big argument between the 2 coalitions was whose ideas were these first. Our concern is that the policies themselves are not good. This mix between a developmental state and neoliberal state intervening and mix and match type policy has not proven successful. My disappointment with the opposition is that they have not come up with an alternative model. And this is the major disillusionment that many people who voted for the opposition have today.
As an economist, what are the prescriptions from for the development of Malaysian economy or modernization of Malaysian economy?
Well, my personal view is this: I would look at the nature of the corporate sector. If you look at the corporate sector today, 99% of companies can be classified as SMEs. 99%. That is where the focus should be. How do we help nurture thriving domestic SMEs? And when we did the research on SMEs, we found that there are still a lot of dynamic SMEs. What they need is to free them up in the sense that, look, we cannot have affirmative action-based policies where people fear a state that can expropriate their companies. Second, we need to channel a lot of funds to these companies to invest in R&D so that they can build on their technologies. They have the technological know-how. They need to develop this know-how through real R&D. That's a lot of money, and they have to channel a lot of funds there too. And 3, help create markets for them too. The most important thing we found among SMEs was creating a market for themselves and for their products. And I think here the state can play that role. There's not been enough focus on these issues. And there's a reason for that. It's the politics of the state that define the economic development model. And the politics of the state now is one still based on patronage and race-based patronage. And that's going to hold back the country.
What Malaysia can learn from India in terms of economic models?
Well, I'm no expert on India, so I can't say too much.
You're observing the Indian economic development models.
I am looking at the Indian development model, but I tried to garner some lessons from there. One of the lessons, since we're on the topic of R&D, is who really funds R&D in this country. It's the state. The state plays a big role through the research-based institutions to fund R&D. This R&D is now linked to businesses. And then this R&D is channeled down to businesses so that they can take all this knowledge and commercialize it. And that's when you see this dynamic relationship between the state and businesses. And if the state is financing R&D and then bringing in dynamic companies to commercialize that R&D, then you can get a very thriving relationship here between the state and this large SME base that we see here. There's a lot of support, I feel, for entrepreneurship in this country. What I see about India is that there's a lot of major privately owned companies which have shown the capacity to even go transnational and have become big players in the international economy. That's something to learn from them. What were the mechanisms that were put in place which allow them to become major enterprises, even transnational enterprises that could compete globally. Here we can even learn not just from India, but also look at Korea and Japan and Taiwan and see how this can be done. Taiwan, to my mind, is the real country that we should look at. Taiwan is the country because Taiwan's economy, if you look at it, 98% of the companies are SMEs. These SMEs are extremely dynamic. They reinvest much of their profits. They are not dependent on banks for loans. They don't have that relationship with the banks that we see in Korea or Japan or even in Malaysia. And they have shown the capacity to be extremely innovative to the point that they can even go abroad and thrive abroad. The other thing which I found very interesting about Taiwan is the way they create production linkages with each other. This is something which I've seen also in India, which I've also feel that we should have with Malaysia. Production linkages, especially between domestic firms and transnational firms, which allows them to capture a bigger market. I think these things are not hard to do. These things can easily be done too because the companies are there on the ground. It's how we reorientate our policies to ensure that we target the companies that are truly entrepreneurial so that they can be really driven, be the real drivers of economic growth.
See, the Malaysian state has been implementing ethnicity-based public policies by telling the world that they want to bring in economic equity of the various races. How it is possible, because when you're trying to do this, automatically I hope there'll be it's a fallacy. It's a wrong policy. I feel so. So what is your perception of this?
First of all, let me say this. Affirmative action is a progressive policy. Affirmative action, even here in India, it was based on the notion of target marginalized people. And if you look at affirmative action in Malaysia, it targeted Malays because they had long been marginalized during colonial rule. If you ask me, affirmative action 1970, were they on the right path? I'll say yes. It was not a bad policy when it was introduced. But next, we look what were the key aspects of affirmative action. They had two. One was education, the other was business. In education, where we are different from India, is that in Malaysia, the government spent a lot of money on schools, where they built very good schools, residential schools, manned these schools with excellent teachers, took poor children from rural areas, sent them to these excellent residential schools with good teachers, trained them from young. And these people then went on to university, both locally as well as abroad, and they emerged as the new Malaysian middle class. Many people look at Malaysia's affirmative action and say it's a success story because of its successful creation of an independent Malay middle class. I am not critical of that. In fact, I'm very supportive of that. And I will say that is something we should focus on and use education as a mechanism to get people out of poverty and create an independent middle class of them. Then they'll be independent. They don't need any more state support. The second dimension of affirmative action, where I say we failed, was affirmative action in business. We were warned, if you read the literature, many people had warned Malaysian leaders that affirmative action in business doesn't work. Affirmative action in education, yes, that's the way forward. But they stuck to that. In fact, we neglected our attention on education, and the quality of education in the public schools or in public universities have gone down. While in business, which is a flawed policy, we maintained it and we keep maintaining it, and we waste a lot of resources on it. That is where we have to rectify. Remove affirmative action in business because it's not working.
Do you welcome the implementation of GST?
Yes, I think it's an alternative form of revenue which the government needs. We can't always be dependent on oil. That's an important issue. But I'll be more careful about how they implement the GST, what kind of products they introduce it for, especially for the poor. It is a huge burden on the poor to have GST. That's one of my main concerns with the GST.
I think Malaysia economy has been very slow. The recent years. Why do you think so?
Uh, let me go back to 19. Let me go back to the period when we had the global financial crisis. 2008. When we had the global financial crisis, one of the consequences of that was there was a transition in government and Najib came to power. Najib looked upon the economy and he said, we need to do two things. One, remove cronyism and corruption and rent-seeking. It's there in his public statements and public policies. The second thing he said was, let's remove affirmative action in business. He actually announced it. But there was a major backlash from his party, as well as former Prime Minister Mahathir. And so what happened from that was he reintroduced affirmative action, but he called it market-friendly affirmative action. That's an oxymoron. We already know it doesn't work, and I think that was a mistake on his part. That again held investors back. In fact, if you look at the 11th Malaysia Plan, the 10th Malaysia Plan introduced market-friendly affirmative action. The 11th Malaysia Plan doesn't review it, doesn't even want to talk about it, an indication the policy has failed. And yet, the government in 2013 introduced a new policy called the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy, another affirmative action-based policy. And he said, the Prime Minister said, I'm instructing all the government-linked companies, especially the top 20 publicly listed companies, to implement the policy. So here we have a big problem. The reintroduction of affirmative action, again race-based, and exploiting the thriving GLCs to be the tool through which this policy is to be implemented.
You mean to say that there is no paradigm shift in terms of the new economic model introduced by Najib?
Najib talked in 2008 of a new economic model. We all waited for it. And he backtracked. Initially, he said the right things. Then he backtracked. And when we finally looked at his new economic model, there was nothing new there. It was a rehash of Mahathir's mix and match state intervention and neoliberal type policies. In fact, there was a significant event when he introduced it in Parliament. The opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, former Deputy Prime Minister and former Finance Minister, ran out of Parliament, called for a press conference, and he said, those ideas are my ideas. And we were shocked. Why is the opposition leader saying that? But it made sense because Anwar was with Mahathir when all these ideas were introduced. And now Najib is reintroducing Mahathir's old ideas. There was nothing new in those policies. And that's why there's no investor confidence here. Now, the second issue, which I mentioned, was he also said he's going to remove cronyism, patronage, and corruption and rent-seeking. It has become even worse. As I said, now critics refer to it as the kleptocratic state. So you have a double whammy, a kleptocratic state where there's serious corruption, and you have affirmative action-based policies reintroduced. I can't see how the economy is going to grow in these circumstances.
What are the areas where the Indian business community can flourish in or excel in? Because there are some areas they have not been there. So, what is your point of view?
Well, there's a class dimension to this. There have been Indians who have been long established in the jewelry sector, SMEs, textile, and food. They're actually thriving. You'll find some very dynamic firms in the jewelry sector, and they've moved up. You will find some very, very prominent companies in textile, even become publicly listed companies like Kamda, Valiram Group, major companies. Then there are those in the food sector, and they're growing, they're doing quite well. They've become more fusion type food, but they're still Indian owned and they're thriving. Then there's the second group, which I would call the new middle class. The new middle class would be a different type. They're well educated, they've got class resources, they will go into more professional, technological type things. But they need the encouragement to go in if we are to tap into their potential. So that's the potential I want to tap into more, I feel. The others can survive, and I think they'll continue to grow. They're quite dynamic, and they'll remain dynamic within those sectors. But it's new sectors we want to look to. But those new sectors, middle class people are not really risk takers. And if they are, they'll want a state that is supportive, not one that is exploitative or expropriates their wealth. So that system is not in place yet. So I don't see that group thriving at all. And finally, we have those at the real micro level. I feel you do find some entrepreneurial capacity there, but not enough of the type that will help them get out of poverty and make them really dynamic firms. I think the state has not put in place a proper, viable structural system, institutional system to support people at the grassroots level to create that base. Although they have been channeling a lot of money down, but not through the state, but through NGOs. The NGOs, I don't think, really have a good idea how to use that money effectively to develop thriving domestic micro-based enterprises.
I'd like to know what is the level of entrepreneurial, what is the level of Indian women participation in business?
Interestingly, that you can see at the micro level. And here we find that the government is trying to follow the similar to the Grameen Bank's model in Bangladesh. They're trying to do that here in Malaysia. They did it, and it was fairly successful. It had worked quite well. That's why I said I do think there is some kind of entrepreneurial capacity in the ground, very prevalent among women. But whether they have been able to tap into it and allow them to build on it, there must be support for businesses at that level. The history of the developmental state that were very successful was there was a lot of support of companies at the micro and the small level to nurture those infant industries and to allow them to grow. There hasn't been enough of that kind of support. When I've talked to SMEs, they said, yes, there was some support when I was starting out, startups and all that, they have the framework there. But when I want to move to the next level, I can't. There's no support at that level. And I asked them why. They say the government thinks we're already making money. Why do they need to support us anymore? We keep telling them for investment purposes, it's very expensive and very risky. They're scared too. But the government is not looking at it that way. So the alternative is for the government to go actively into R&D like India does and use that R&D and channel it down to those companies. But that relationship has not panned out, it's not worked out in Malaysia yet.
Finally, what you're researching on, and also do you have any plan to write a book on Indian business community?
I have a PhD student looking at Indian SMEs. The research is extremely interesting. We went in thinking the second and third generation, Malaysia has moved on. We don't accept migrants in large numbers. The Indian migrants who came have died off. Most of them have already died off. We are now looking at second, third generation Indians. We thought that the way they do business would have changed, but we found that, interestingly enough, it's not true. The Indians were still very much remaining in ethnic enclaves. They've gone to the Tamil schools. So they've been socialized by their Tamil school education. They live in these enclaves. So they remain very ethnic Indian in their thinking and the way they do business. Then we have Indians who have become the new middle class. They're very multiracial in their thinking and they do businesses in a different way. And the way in which they have evolved their enterprises is very multi-ethnic and they've created inter-ethnic business network ties. So this is an interesting new finding. And when we look at the elite companies, they are really multiracial. If you look at Tony Fernandez, his partner is Malay. If you look at Ananda Krishnan, his key allies are the Malay leaders. And if you look at all the other major companies, they are very multi-ethnic in their orientation. So there's a diversity of Indian businesses in the country. We found this out to be very interesting and we want to capture the implications of this diversity in terms of how Indian businesses also operate. It also draws attention to one important point. There remains a large segment of Indians who remain marginalized. And this is a question that we must ask of the state. Why do these Indians still remain marginalized? We've already seen the implications of that with the Hindraft movement. And this may again explode if the Indians continue to remain marginalized.
Thank you so much. Really, you gave us an insightful discussion about the Malaysian contemporary political economy. Thank you so much.